Again, this module is going to be over radiation incidents and response. This is the longest module, so please just bear with me. I'll try to move quickly and try not to bore you by reading off the slides and saying every word. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started. As most of you know, in Hamilton County, we have several sources of ionizing radiation. For example, medical and veterinary clinics use radiation for X-rays, irradiators, and radiotherapy. Many research facilities, such as universities and industrial companies, may possess radioactivity and different types of radioactive materials. One source of radiation people may forget about is transportation. Hamilton County has several major transportation systems running through it, such as the highways and railways. At any time, radioactive material could be transported through our county. If one of these transportation vehicles is wrecked, we could have a radiation emergency on our hands. And as most of you know, we have two nuclear facilities in our area. We have Sequoia, which is here in Hamilton County, and Watts Bar, which is in Bradley County. So the most likely radiological event that we could have here in Hamilton County would be a transportation or facility event. Every year, around 500 billion packages are shipped in the United States. 400 million of those are hazardous, and of those, about 3 million are radioactive. The Department of Energy alone transports about 20,000 radioactive shipments per year. Because of the sheer number of shipments, a transportation incident is most likely to occur. But despite this, there have been no serious nuclear radiation exposures as a result of a transportation accident. This is in part due to the strict requirements of radioactive packaging. Besides transportation risk, we also have several facilities in our county that hold radioactive materials. These kinds of facilities are required to meet the federal standards for storage, use, and security of any radioactive materials. And though most of them are good about meeting these standards, there are several that choose to ignore these requirements, which can lead to the materials being stored and secured incorrectly. This can cause an issue for anyone who may be responding to an incident at any of those kinds of facilities. Vehicles transporting radiological materials in any facility that houses radioactive materials are required to have some kind of marking or placard. These markings may not always be on the outside of the vehicle or building, but instead may be on the individual housing of the radioactive material. Most placards and signs will either say radioactive or have that tri-blade universal symbol for radioactivity. When you are responding to any type of incident, it is important to look for those markings so that you know what kinds of risk you may be facing. Many radiological placards and markings can provide you with some useful information. Being able to interpret this information can help you when you are responding. So for example, each Roman numeral represents a radioactive class. On the contents line, you will see the type of radioactive material. The activity line will let you know the amount of radioactivity, and the transportation index will tell you the acceptable radiation level outside of any unbroken box at 1 meter away. The white 1 label is used for packages with a maximum dose rate of 0.5 millirems per hour on the outside of the package. This measurement is taken on contact with the package. The yellow 2 label is based on the package with a maximum dose of 50 millirems per hour, and the yellow 3 label has a maximum of 200 millirems per hour. So switching gears a little, you may be interested in knowing what your role and responsibilities may be if you're responding to a transportation or facility incident involving any type of radioactive material. Of course, first and foremost are your life-saving duties. You will assist with protecting the public and emergency responders, as well as helping with any rescue efforts and scene security and contamination control. So this slide is just a reiteration of the last. If you are the first on the scene, make sure you're following all of the proper procedures to ensure the safety of the public and the first responders. For scene control, you will want to set up a hot, warm, and cold zone. The hot zone, which is the contaminated zone, will initially be 75 feet until determined that it needs to be larger or smaller based on the materials present. In the warm zone, the decon line will be set up, and in the cold zone, which is going to be that clean zone, make sure that all personnel and equipment not required in the hot zone are positioned here in order to keep them from becoming contaminated. Moving on to an incident at the nuclear power plant. So if all of the safety features fail, a radioactive plume could cause problems for Hamilton County. To begin with, all of Hamilton County falls within the 50-mile ingestion exposure pathway, and a majority falls within that 10-mile emergency planning zone, or EPZ. Also, a good part of our county falls within the Watts-Bar 50-mile ingestion pathway. Within the 10-mile EPZ, there is a risk of whole body exposure through gamma radiation, thyroid exposure through inhalation, and exposure to critical organs through inhalation. For the 50-mile ingestion pathway, food and water can become contaminated, which could result in the increase of radiation-induced cancer. As we discussed in the Radiation Basics module, there are 3 types of radiation that can be released from a nuclear plant. These are alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha is the least penetrating and can easily be blocked by a piece of paper or even by your skin. And since it's the largest particle, it can only travel a short distance. The main hazard associated with alpha is internal contamination. For beta radiation, it can be blocked by a plastic and can travel only a few feet in the air. Like alpha, it also can be an internal hazard and can cause harm to your skin and eyes. The third is gamma. Gamma can only be shielded by thick, dense material such as lead or concrete. Since it will pass right through your body, you are at highest risk of whole body dose. As a nuclear plant, we have divided the emergency planning zone into 23 sectors. Within those 10 miles, there are over 93,000 people, 25 schools, 22 daycares, 15 assisted living centers, and over 150 individuals with functional needs. Within that 50-mile ingestion pathway radius, we have over 1 million people. When there's an event at the nuclear plant, TVA will notify TEMA and then notify local department leads, such as the Director of Hamilton County Office of Emergency Management. At this time, the Sequoia or Watts Bar plan will become activated. Each department lead will activate their department as outlined in that plan. Each plant has 4 levels of emergency classification. These are notification of unusual event, alert, site area emergency, and general emergency. At each classification level, each agency's response is different. If you want to see your agency's responsibilities, you can go look at the Hamilton County Multi-Jurisdictional Radiological Emergency Response Plan. So there are several ways the public can be notified if there is an event at the nuclear plant. These notification systems can be activated through the state SEOC or County 911. These systems include fixed siren system, which are the sirens spaced out around that 10-mile EPZ, the emergency alert system, tone alert radios, and emergency responders going door to door informing people of the situation. Okay, so most of the information on this slide was gone over earlier in this module, so I'm just going to go over it quickly. If there is an incident at the plant, you will be responsible for transporting casualties and functional needs persons requiring medical transport. You will also assist with protection of the public and emergency responders, assist with rescue and contamination control, and doing anything listed in your agency's responsibilities in that multi-jurisdictional radiological emergency response plan. If there is a nuclear event at Sequoia, these are going to be our top priorities for protecting the public. We want to make sure that everyone is sheltering in place or that we are evacuating vulnerable populations such as children and those with functional needs. We're also going to shelter in place or help evacuate the general public. And then prioritizing security for evacuated areas and routes, shelters, and staging and recovery sites. We will prioritize the monitoring and decontamination of all emergency workers and the public, as well as provide radioactive protective drugs such as KI. During a radiological emergency, you may hear two different terms. Those are going to be shelter in place or lockdown. A shelter in place is directed upon release or immediate release of radiation and is the preferred method for protecting the general public. When a shelter in place is ordered, people will be asked to stay inside and seal off all ventilation systems, windows, and doors. We also have lockdown, which is similar to a shelter in place, but is normally directed to help protect vulnerable populations, such as schools, medical facilities, and assisted living centers. Here's some things you should keep in mind when an evacuation is in place. Remember that most people will evacuate prior to an official notice. Word is going to spread quickly if something does start to happen at that plant. So many people will begin to evacuate before an official order is actually sent out. This will also happen at the schools. Parents will begin finding out that something's happening and begin picking up their children before the evacuation may begin. A high percentage of people will stay with family or friends and will not actually stay at a shelter. Some individuals with functional needs or without transportation will require evacuation assistance. Also, some residents will resist evacuation. In situations like these, it's unlike a natural disaster such as a hurricane where people can choose to not follow an evacuation order. But for a radiological event, people must evacuate their homes. Because they may pose a risk to themselves or other people if they become contaminated, they have to be forced to leave. Moving on to shelters. So there are 11 shelters within the 4 counties designated for a Sequoia emergency. As I mentioned a few slides back, there will only be a small portion of people who will actually stay at a shelter. We have planned for sheltering up to 20% of our population. All the shelters are going to be in place will be managed by the American Red Cross, and the Hamilton County Health Department will be conducting the public monitoring and decontamination processes. Another kind of site that will be set up during an evacuation is the shelter information points. We have currently pre-designated 8 sites around the county where people can go to obtain additional information on evacuation routes and shelter locations. First responders can also go to these sites to get monitored for any contamination. As I said before, we have 11 shelters spread out between 4 different counties. All shelters will either be in Hamilton, Meigs, Ray, or Sequatchie County. Once the event is over, people in evacuated areas can return home as soon as conditions permit. These areas must be checked and decontaminated, which can take a significant amount of time. When the initial response is over, recovery efforts will begin once the problem at the plant has been resolved and the evacuated areas are deemed safe for habitation. These efforts will be initiated by the state governor at the recommendation of the director of TEMA, Commissioner of Environmental and Conservation, and TVA officials. And that concludes our very long module on radiation incidents and response. If you have any questions, you can always contact me at the number on the screen.